Welcome to our channel. We provide free review materials for you to study and prepare the Licensure's examination for teachers. Study with us, using problem-based learning approach every day. You can also visit our Facebook page for daily review notes. Just see video description for the link. Please do us a favor, click the subscribe button below to catch up for next review-related videos. Teachers can facilitate learning by making the educational process easier for students. This does not mean watering down the curriculum or lowering standards. Rather, facilitating learning involves teaching students to think critically and understand how the learning process works. Looking at the definition to understand learning and knowledge acquisition, learning is the acquisition and development of memories and behaviors, including skills, knowledge, understanding, values and wisdom. It is the goal of education, and the product of experience. It is therefore a relatively permanent change in behavior. It is a process inferred from relatively stable changes in behavior that result through practice of interaction with an adaptation to the environment. The development of new associations is a result of experience. And the modification of an organism's behavior is a result of maturation and environmental experience. As an example, people learn to practice social distancing as a protocol for coronavirus disease prevention. This is a step-by-step process to adapt the so-called new normal. Where did all this definition came from? To further discuss this topic, let's find out the theories of learning and the people behind every theory. Edward Thorndike is known for connectionism or associationism theory. Human activity is based on association between stimulus and response. Under this theory is the law of effect, the law of exercise, and the law of readiness. Edward Thorndike put forward a law of effect which stated that any behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences is likely to be repeated, and any behavior followed by unpleasant consequences is likely to be stopped. While the law of exercise stated that behavior is more strongly established through frequent connections of stimulus and response. A law which states that learning is dependent upon the learner's readiness to act, which facilitates the strengthening of the bond between stimulus and response. For example, an athlete who is highly motivated and eager to learn is more likely to be receptive to learning than one who is poorly motivated. Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. It is based on adhesive principle, which means that a response is attached to a stimulus, through the stimulus occurring just prior to the response, so that the recurrence of the stimulus will evoke or cause the response. Like many great scientific advances, Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning was discovered accidentally. Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov was researching salivation in dogs in response to being fed. He inserted a small test tube into the cheek of each dog to measure saliva when the dogs were fed with a powder made from meat. Pavlov predicted the dogs would salivate in response to the food placed in front of them, but he noticed that his dogs would begin to salivate whenever they heard the footsteps of his assistant who was bringing them the food. When Pavlov discovered that any object or event which the dogs learned to associate with food, such as the lab assistant, would trigger the same response. He realized that he had made an important scientific discovery. Accordingly, he devoted the rest of his career to studying this type of learning. B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Organism has to do something in order to get reward, that is, it must operate on its environment. Reinforcement is any behavioral consequence that strengthens behavior. It increases the likelihood of the recurrence of a particular type of response. Types of reinforcement includes positive reinforcement. These reinforces increase frequency. If your child acts out during a shopping trip, you might give him a treat to get him to be quiet. Because you have positively reinforced the misbehavior, he will probably be more likely to act out again in the future in order to receive another treat. Negative reinforcement, which strengthens behavior by their removal. A child chews gum in class, which is against the rules. The punishment is the teacher disciplining them in front of the class. The child stops chewing gum in class. With negative punishment, you take away a positive reinforcement in response to a behavior. Primary reinforcement examples: food, water, sleep. And lastly, secondary reinforcement examples: money, grades, starts, tokens. Albert Bandura is known for social learning theory. This put emphasis on observational learning. Albert Bandura claims that children continually learn desirable and undesirable behavior through observational learning. This basically occurs when an individual first learns a behavior by observing another individual, and that individual serves as a model through whom other individuals learn the behavior, and so on. Wolfgang Kohler's insight theory. Gaining insight is a gradual process of exploring, analyzing and restructuring perceptions until a solution is arrived at. German psychologist Wolfgang Kohler was studying the behavior of apes. He designed some simple experiments that led to the development of one of the first cognitive theories of learning, which he called insight learning. Kohler used the term insight to describe the learning of his apes. Insight involves the following criteria. The situation as a whole is perceived by the learner. The learner tries to see and judge the relationship between various factors involved in the situation. Insight, in learning theory, immediate and clear learning or understanding that takes place without overt trial and error testing. Insight occurs in human learning when people recognize relationships or make novel associations between objects or actions that can help them solve new problems. Gestalt theory by Kohler, Wertheimer and Kafka. The primary focus of this theory is on perception and how people assign meanings to visual stimuli. The whole is more than the sum of all its parts. Gestalt principles are laws or rules that describe how the human eye perceives visual elements. These principles aim to show how complex scenes can be reduced to more simple shapes. They also aim to explain how the eyes perceive the shapes as a single, united form rather than the separate simpler elements involved. Gestalt psychologists argued that these principles exist because the mind has an innate disposition to perceive patterns in the stimulus based on certain rules. These principles are organized into 5 categories: proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, and connectedness. Kurt Lewin's topological and vector theory or field theory. The behavior of an individual at a given moment is the result of existing forces operating simultaneously in his life space. The internal and external forces. Kurt Lewin, unlike Pavlov, Skinner and Gestaltian psychologists, conducted experiments on the study of behavior of children. He utilized an elaborate experimental setup with a view to control the child's total environment during the course of the investigation for getting detailed information. Lewin emphasized the study of behavior as a function of the total physical and social situation. Lewin holds that psychological laws need not be formulated solely on the basis of statistical averages. Rather, the individual case is equally important. Even if all general psychological laws were known, we would still need to understand the specific individual and total situation in which he exists before we could make any prediction about his behavior. Thus Lewin favors an idiographic psychology in which the focus is on the individual, as opposed to nomothetic psychology, where the emphasis is on statistical average. Jerome Bruner's theory, also known as instrumental conceptualism. Learning involves 3 simultaneously processes: acquisition, transformation, and evaluation. Jerome Bruner, a cognitive psychologist, created a theory of development based upon the idea that the goal of education should be intellectual development. Applying this in the classroom, the role of the teacher should not be to teach information by rote learning or a memorization technique based on repetition, but instead, to facilitate the learning process. Information processing theory. The theory describes the psychological events in terms of transformations of information from input to output. It stresses the value of perception, attention and memory in the learning process. Developmental psychologists who adopt the information processing perspective account for mental development in terms of maturational changes in basic components of a child's mind. The theory is based on the idea that humans process the information they receive rather than merely responding to stimuli. Thank you for watching and don't forget to click the subscribe button below. I hope these add up to your knowledge. Stay connected and updated for our new video.